When you hear the name Jack the Ripper, well, it brings up this very specific kind of dread, doesn't it?
Yeah, this image of a shadowy figure in those gaslit London streets.
Leaving behind just this trail of unsolved horror. It's a mystery that's really stuck around for, well, over a century now.
Absolutely, sparking endless theories, intense speculation. And the thing is, despite all the police work then and, constant research since.
We still don't know who he was.
Exactly. Which means a lot of different people from that time have come under suspicion, often for reasons that, frankly, tell you more about the public's need for an answer than actual hard proof.
And today, we're looking at one specific man. He was undeniably a brutal killer himself.
Oh, no question. But his own crimes and the massive attention they got led many people back then to wonder, could he also be Jack the Ripper?
His name was Frederick Bailey Deeming.
Right. And by sort of tracing his own disturbing story and putting it next to the timeline of the Whitechapel murders, we can kind of see why people made that connection.
And understand the complexities and the darkness involved in trying to solve these historical cases.
It's a grim story, definitely. But it shines a light on, public reaction, maybe hysteria, and the real challenges of investigation, even across oceans.
So stick with us as we piece together why Deeming was considered, and importantly, why the evidence doesn't really stack up in the end.
Okay, so Frederick Bailey Deeming. Who was he? Let's start at the start.
He was born in England, 1853.
Mm-hmm.
His early life.
It's a bit hazy, isn't it?
It is. He later claimed he'd spent time in asylums, suffered from epilepsy, things like that.
But his own brother disputed those claims.
He did. So right from the beginning, there's this question mark over his story, his reliability.
What seems clearer, though, is that he ran away to sea, around 16.
Yes, that seems pretty well established. And that really marks the beginning of a life that was characterized by theft and getting money under false pretenses, deception, basically.
A pattern setting in early. And he was good at changing who he was, wasn't he? Using different names. Oh, constantly. Throughout his life. Names like Lawson, Williams, Swanston. Quite a few.
That ability to just slip into different identities must have been useful for him later on.
Absolutely central to his method, really. So, in February 1881, he marries a woman named Maria James in England.
Okay.
But almost immediately after the wedding, he leaves her behind. Sails for Australia alone.
Wow. Straight away. That's jarring, right at the start of a marriage.
It really is. And his dishonest streak followed him. 1882, he's in Sydney, does 6 weeks in prison for theft.
So trouble finds him, or he finds it.
Seems that way. But despite this, he later sends for Maria, and she actually goes, joins him in Sydney.
Okay, so they reunite.
They do. And by 1886, they have 2 daughters born in Australia.
So on the surface, maybe a family life, but built on shaky ground, it sounds like.
Very shaky, because
Yeah.
the deception never stopped. In 1888, and this is a critical year for our story, he writes back to his brothers in England.
What does he say?
Claims he and the family are coming back home, and that he's made a considerable fortune.
Which wasn't true at all.
Not even close. He was just projecting this false image of success like he always did.
And 1888 is, of course, the year we need to focus on regarding Jack the Ripper.
Exactly. The 5 murders, the ones generally accepted as the Ripper's work, they all happened in Whitechapel, London, between August and November of 1888.
A pretty tight time frame.
Yeah.
And confined to that specific area of East London.
Yes. So this is where the big question comes in. Where on earth was Frederick Bailey Deeming during those specific months?
That's the crucial link, or potential link, isn't it?
It's the absolute core of the speculation. Now, reports from the time, contemporary accounts, they mostly placed Deeming in South Africa during that period.
South Africa. That's a long way from Whitechapel.
A very long way. Apparently, he was involved in some kind of diamond mine swindle down there.
Okay, so if he was in South Africa...
And he couldn't be the Ripper. Travel time by steamship back then, England to South Africa, was about 3 weeks, one way.
So being in both places between August and November 1888 seems impossible.
Logistically, yes, it seems impossible.
But how certain are those records? I mean, tracking someone's exact movements day by day over a century ago? That sounds incredibly tough.
And it is incredibly tough. You're right. While the prevailing belief, certainly around the time of his later arrest, was that he was in South Africa, the lack of absolute certainty about his precise location for every single day did leave a sliver of doubt, enough for people who were desperate to find the Ripper.
So people wondered, could he have stopped in London on the way? Could the dates be slightly wrong? That kind of thing.
Exactly that kind of thing. It's that little bit of uncertainty that allowed the theories to take root initially.
So this big question mark hangs over his 1888 location, precisely when the Ripper was active. But we know for sure he did come back to England eventually.
Oh, yes, definitely. He arrived by steamship in Hull on the East Coast. That was in November 1889.
Okay, so about a year after the main Ripper killings had stopped. And did he settle down? Change his ways?
Not a chance. Landed and went right back to his old tricks. Took lodgings in Beverly, which is near Hull.
Under his own name?
Nope. Adopted the name Harry Lawson. Presented himself as this wealthy, retired sheep farmer from Queensland. Spun tales about his massive income.
The same pattern. Creating a false persona.
All completely calculated. Designed to impress people, gain trust, and, well, entrap them.
It worked again.
It did. He ended up bigamously marrying Helen Matheson people, called her Nellie. She was the daughter of his landlady.
He married his landlady's daughter, while still married to Maria.
Yes. They married in Beverly, February 18, 1890. And it's chilling when you realize that was almost exactly 9 years to the month after he married Maria James back in England.
Wow. So this wasn't just a mistake or a one-off situation. It was absolutely a deliberate pattern.
A deeply ingrained pattern, creating these elaborate fake lives, juggling relationships under different names. And this dual life, this charade, it continued until early 1892.
Which is when everything unraveled.
Yes. That's when his truly monstrous actions finally came into the light.
And the discovery itself was horrific. It happened in Melbourne, didn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what directly sparked the Ripper talk.
That's right. March 3rd, 1892. A house Deeming had recently rented on Andrew Street in Melbourne. The landlord noticed this awful smell. He investigated, went into the second bedroom, and saw the ground under the hearthstone looked odd. It had been cemented over recently.
Oh, no.
He had to get a pickaxe to break through the concrete.
A pickaxe. Just the thought of that.
It's incredibly grim. As he broke through, the smell just got overwhelming. His pickaxe hit something softer.
Oh, God.
He managed to shift this big slab of concrete, and, well, he found the remains of a woman named Emily Mather. She'd been staying there with the tenant, who is known as Albert Williams.
Another alias. Deeming?
Another alias for Deeming, yes. The landlord described seeing auburn hair and the remains of a face.
Just horrific. And the postmortem confirmed how she died.
It did. Emily Mather's skull had been severely bashed in, and her throat was cut. So brutal. And the police quickly figured out who Albert Williams really was.
Yes. The investigation rapidly identified the vanished tenant as Frederick Bailey Deeming.
And that wasn't the end of the discoveries, was it? The investigation in Australia actually led back to England.
It did. Once they knew it was Deeming, they started looking into his past connections in England. They searched properties linked to him.
Including a house near Liverpool.
Yes, a place called Dinham Villa in Rainhill. And there, they found the bodies of his first wife, Maria James, and their 4 children.
All 4 children.
All 4. Buried right there on the property.
My God. So Deeming wasn't just a murderer, he was a mass murderer. He'd killed his entire first family years before, and no one knew until now.
Exactly. The scale of it, the sheer cold-bloodedness, the brutality of his own confirmed crimes, finding this out just created this huge worldwide sensation.
I can only imagine. And with the Jack the Ripper mystery still unsolved, still fresh in people's minds. The parallels were drawn almost instantly. The press, the public, they immediately started asking, could this man, capable of this level of depravity, who we now know is in England around that time, could he be the one? Could Deeming be Jack the Ripper?
It sounds like it just exploded. What were the specific things that made people seriously consider him, the arguments linking him?
Well, there were several points that seemed pretty compelling to a lot of people back then, especially given the climate of fear and speculation.
Like what?
First, the method. Deeming bashed skulls, he cut throats. Those methods resonated very strongly, very grimly, with what was known about the Ripper's attacks.
Right, the level of violence felt familiar.
Yes. And second, the way he concealed his victims, cementing Emily Mather under the hearthstone, burying his family in the garden. It suggested this cold, calculating nature.
A lack of remorse. Planning.
Exactly. Which seems similar to how the Ripper managed to evade capture again and again. There was also this feeling that Deeming's crimes showed a profound, insanity. A kind of malevolent force that people felt must have driven the Whitechapel killer, too.
sort of chilling, almost inhuman feel to the crimes themselves.
Precisely. And then adding fuel to this fire were newspaper reports that started popping up after Deeming's arrest.
What kind of reports?
Claims that people had actually seen Deeming in Whitechapel back in 1888, even that he'd been seen buying knives there.
Wow. Those alleged sightings must have sounded like a smoking gun to a public desperate for answers.
They certainly did, though, again, it's important to remember these reports often came out after he was already the prime suspect, which makes you question their reliability a bit.
Sure. What else?
There was also talk about his potential skills. His Melbourne victim, Emily Mather, had mentioned in the letter something about his skill with medicine.
The medical connection often brought up with the Ripper.
Exactly. And a doctor who examined the bodies found at Rainhill suggested Deeming might have had some anatomical knowledge, maybe based on how cleanly the cuts were made.
So, skill with instruments, knowledge of anatomy, classic parts of the Ripper profile speculation seem to fit, or were made to fit.
They were made to fit, yes. And then maybe the most sensational claim of all.
Oh, what?
It was widely reported that while Deeming was awaiting trial in Australia, he actually boasted to other inmates that he was Jack the Ripper.
He bragged about it. Did he ever confess officially?
No, never to the authorities. But these alleged boasts were printed in the papers and had a huge impact on how people saw him. Plus, his obvious mental instability and the horrifying way he killed his own family were also seen by some as, further links, suggesting this deep shared pathology with the Ripper.
Okay, looking at all of that together, the brutality, the concealment, the alleged sightings, the medical hints, the boasting, you can really understand why, in the heat of that moment, people pointed at Deeming and thought, this has to be him.
You absolutely can. It seemed to fit.
But, as you mentioned earlier, there were pretty big counter-arguments, weren't there? Evidence that strongly suggested he wasn't the Ripper.
Crucially, yes. And the biggest one, the most significant piece of conflicting evidence, was his location in 1888.
Back to South Africa.
Back to South Africa. As we discussed, the contemporary accounts, the information available at the time, strongly indicated he was there when the canonical Ripper murders were happening in London.
And if he was in South Africa?
He simply could not have been in Whitechapel committing those murders. The timing just doesn't work.
And the police, the official investigators, what did they think?
They largely agreed. Police officials at the time denied any connection between Deeming and the Ripper case. Some investigators specifically dismissed him based on those reports of him being in South Africa, maybe even imprisoned there for part of that time.
So the professionals looking at the actual evidence weren't convinced by the public or press speculation?
Not officially, no. And there's another really critical difference that's often pointed out: the victims. The Ripper specifically, exclusively, targeted sex workers in the Whitechapel area. Deeming, on the other hand, murdered women and children he knew intimately. People he had formed close personal relationships with his wives, his own children.
That's a completely different victim profile.
It really is. The difference in who they targeted and even how they interacted with them beforehand suggests very different motivations. A different type of killer altogether.
A different psychology driving the violence.
Exactly. Looking back, it seems pretty clear that the intense public pressure to finally name Jack the Ripper, combined with the genuine horror of Deeming's proven crimes, it probably led the press and the public to latch onto him too quickly, maybe overlooking or downplaying the inconvenient facts like his timeline because they needed someone. He became a convenient scapegoat for the Ripper's crimes because he was demonstrably capable of monstrous acts himself.
It's a sobering reminder of how badly people wanted an answer, maybe even at the expense of the facts. So let's wrap up Deeming's own story. He was arrested out in Western Australia.
That's right. They caught up with him in Perth, Western Australia, in March 1892. He was initially charged just with Emily Mather's murder in Melbourne. That was the crime that directly led to his capture.
And then transferred to Melbourne for the trial.
Yes.
How did he act during the trial? Was he defiant? Remorseful?
Reports describe him as erratic, prone to angry outbursts. He complained quite bitterly that the newspapers had already convicted him, sealed his fate before the trial even started.
Did he say anything memorable?
He famously insulted the jury at one point, calling them the ugliest race of people he'd ever laid eyes on.
Charming. Not exactly a smart move to win them over.
Not at all. The jury didn't take long. They found him guilty, deliberated for a little more than an hour.
And sentence.
Execution. Frederick Bailey Deeming was hanged in Melbourne on May 23, 1892.
But even after his death, that connection to the Ripper, however tenuous, it didn't just disappear, did it?
No, it lingered. Despite all the counter-evidence, despite the official denials, remarkably, his death mask was actually displayed for years at New Scotland Yard's Black Museum.
Seriously, as Jack the Ripper.
It was shown to visitors, yes, labeled or presented as potentially being that of Jack the Ripper, though it's important to stress, while you might find some fringe theories still floating around, very few serious modern researchers or Ripper historians consider Deeming a likely suspect today, primarily because that evidence placing him outside London in 1888 is just too strong to ignore.
So, bringing it all together, Frederick Bailey Deeming was, without doubt, a truly horrific criminal, a mass murderer responsible for the deaths of his 2 wives and 4 children.
Absolutely horrific.
But the evidence linking him specifically to the Jack the Ripper murders seems mostly circumstantial, driven by the timing of his capture and the brutality of his own crimes, and it's largely contradicted by his likely whereabouts.
That sums it up well. His story is just this powerful, dark example of the immense pressure everyone felt, police, public press, to finally put a name to the Whitechapel killer.
His arrest for his own terrible deeds just happened to coincide with this period where the Ripper mystery was still incredibly raw.
Exactly. His notoriety made him a convenient candidate, even if he wasn't the right one. It really highlights how many different people, some guilty of other awful things, fell under that shadow of Ripper suspicion, often based on, incomplete information, coincidence, or just that intense public hunger for closure.
And the fact that the Jack the Ripper mystery still endures, even after looking closely at figures like Deeming, well, it tells you a lot about the challenges of historical criminal investigation.
It really does. It forces you to think about how information gets recorded and lost, how hard it is to reconstruct timelines across oceans and decades, and how much public emotion and media hype can shape our understanding of the past.
It leaves us with this compelling, maybe unsettling example of just how difficult it can be to separate solid fact from speculation, rumor, and maybe even wishful thinking.
And it reminds us that sometimes, even with historical records and dedicated investigation, the complete truth behind some of history's darkest figures can remain frustratingly just out of reach.